Welcome to Let's Write and Publish an Anthology, everyone. I'm really excited you're here. So what we're going to talk about today is what is a short story. And I'm going to talk about sort of what is the point of the short story? What does it do? I'm going to talk about various aspects of short stories. So what is a short story? It's short. Yeah. Okay. It's shorter than a novel. So in general, there's four lengths of fiction. There is what people call flash fiction these days, which is really, really, really short. And that's sort of part of a short story. And if you can hear this sound, I have a kitten and he is just going crazy playing with his little mousy toy under my desk. Sorry. It's a little distracting. Wally! So there's flash fiction, which is really, really short, and most people consider those a type of short story in general. Then there are novellas, which are long. They're almost like novels, but they're not quite novels. They're like a really long short story. There's novels, right, which you guys I'm sure all read. But then short stories are in this weird, very large area, which is they can be quite short, but they can be quite long. And so for the most part, they're usually between, I don't know, 1,500 and 5,000 words, but there are shorter ones and there are longer ones. So it is short, but that doesn't say much. One thing that is really important about the short story is that it is not part of something bigger. And so this is something that is really important to understand. When somebody reads a short story, like the sort of short story you're going to write in this anthology, there is no outside knowledge necessary. So say you have a really complicated world that you've developed for your story. You can't put all that in there, but at the same time, you can't require that people know it. The way in a novel, say like if you pick up, I don't know, if you pick up Harry Potter book 5, and you say, well, I find this confusing because it doesn't have any explanation about, I don't know, why Harry has a scar on his forehead. Well, that's because you need to read the whole series, right? But in a short story, you cannot do that to your reader. They need to just walk into this and be able to understand everything. And we'll talk about certainly in some session, but later if you want to ask that question, how do you do this? Because if you do have a complex fantasy world, for example, you're just not going to be able to put all the background information in. That's okay, because it focuses on a small theme or a moment. So short stories cannot do what novels do, but novels don't do what short stories do either. They're like two completely different things. Short stories are not just short novels. They focus on something smaller. They tend to be more intense about that smaller thing. Often the time frame is shorter, though not always. This is sort of what you're going to hear me say a lot of, though not always, because there are short stories that break every single rule that I'm going to tell you. Every single rule that you heard in Valerie's presentation, although all of that is true, great writers have broken every single rule that she said. So like there have been great short stories that have no plots. There have been great short stories that are set in 20 different places within one great short story, right? So it's just like all the rules, you can break them, but there are rules. So the short story steps into a situation that is already in motion. I think this is a really interesting aspect of a short story. It doesn't start at the beginning. So like, novels, well, I'm going to bring up Harry Potter again because so many people have read Harry Potter. It's a really good example. Harry Potter starts when Harry's a baby, right? It's like, it just starts way at the beginning. But if J.K. Rowling had wanted to write one standalone story about Harry Potter that would be read by people who didn't know the books before she made the book. She wouldn't have started with him being born or him being a baby. That just wouldn't be the right place to start in a short story. Oh, in a short story, you want to just like feel like your characters are already in motion toward the thing that's going to happen, and they can't stop now. Right? That's the perfect place to start a short story. Its plotting can be freer than a novel. So novels have all these rules. You may have seen things like diagrams, the novel diagram that's the classic diagram that does this, where you have the climax of the story up there, right? Maybe you guys have all seen this. That's not true of a short story, okay? Short stories can have that, but they don't necessarily have that. So yeah, the story arc can be very different in a short story because it's a much more flexible genre. Now, a classic short story will usually have that. Often have that, but that doesn't mean that it has to have that. Another thing is, not all the conflicts in a short story have to resolve. That's just really not necessarily what a short story is about. So it can be about a larger conflict where there's just something small that happens. And so sometimes people call it the change. The point in a short story when your reader realizes that something has happened, but it's often not anywhere near as big as a resolution. So if you have a short story in which two characters are locked in an argument that they can't seem to get out of, like say it's a brother and sister and they've been arguing about something for a long time and they're both really upset about it. And in the story, they have a moment where they feel like they can see that they're going to get out of this in the future. That's a short story. Does not have to, we don't have to have the resolution. We don't have to leave a short story. It's like, oh, the siblings are happy and living happily ever after. You know, that is the fairy tale sort of story, right? But short stories don't have to do that. Okay? So, like I said, I am going to keep going unless anybody asks me questions. So put your hand up if you want to talk or type questions in the chat and I will answer them. So what are some of the forms? Now, the form of the short story, again, is much more flexible than the novel. Most novels have chapters. They have a plot with a story arc. They have characters. They have a setting. They have a really clear structure. And some short stories are like that. So a plot-based short story presents a conflict to be resolved or a puzzle to be solved. So notice novels almost always have a conflict to be resolved, but I added puzzle to be solved because sometimes there isn't a big conflict, but some sort of puzzle or question. That's a good question, Camden. We'll talk about that in a minute. So, so some examples of classic plot-based stories are detective stories and action stories. A story where you have to get to the end of the plot or the story doesn't mean anything, right? If you have a detective story and you never find out who done it, that might not be very satisfying, right? Now, you could have a lyrical story, day in the life of the detective, which does not have a puzzle to be solved. And that would be a story that focuses on imagery and feeling rather than plot. Now, notice that it focuses on imagery and feeling. That doesn't mean that it doesn't have any plot, okay? So, for example, a lot of what you would call literary fiction has a lot of more imagery and feeling in it, and a little less of the plot that you have to find out the end of, right? So I I don't know if, I mean, most of the examples I would give would be adult short stories that would do this, but some of you might have heard of the writer Virginia Woolf, sorry. Why did I say Victoria? Virginia Woolf, okay? Am I going to spell her name correctly? Oy, oy, oy. Virginia Woolf. Yes, two O's. There, I got it right. All right. She tended to write very lyrical stories full of imagery. So she has a story about a woman who's planning a party, who arranges flowers. And so there's, is that a plot? I don't know. But it is satisfying to the reader because they feel like they have learned something about the character or situation. So certain readers aren't really going to like that sort of story, but I like that sort of story. I like all sorts of stories. So don't feel like you have to please everybody, okay? But you can please me, all right? Vignettes. Vignettes are a series of, hello, Esme. Vignettes are a series of very small scenes that come together to create a story. And how that happens, I can't tell you, because it's a very, very fun and unusual way to write. But again, it'll probably have a plot, but the plot isn't the focus. The plot is on the reader reading these little scenes and figuring things out just by seeing the scenes. And at some point, there is a question that they need to answer, a conflict that needs to be resolved, or a puzzle that needs to be solved. But again, the focus is not necessarily on the plot. Anecdote, slice of life stories. Just tell us a little bit about human nature. So the examples here are humor stories and morality stories. Okay, so you guys are probably, when you were younger, certainly read fables, the sort of things where it says, and the moral to this story is always tell the truth, right? That story isn't a story that's going to have a big plot arc. It's usually not going to have a huge amount of development of what happens. But it still is a story. You're probably not going to write one of these, but humor would be, yeah, like The Boy Who Cried Wolf. Exactly, Sapphire. A humor story is an example of stories that are still often told that way. When somebody tells a humor story, you don't usually get a huge amount of detail about the characters, the setting, the plot. It's all about making the reader laugh, right? So that's going to be more on the anecdotal side. And then I just had to put a catch-all thing at the end because, like I said, the short story genre is extremely flexible. You create the form. Why not? There is a writer who I love, again, an adult writer. Most stories for children are pretty traditional plot-based stories, but there's one writer whose book of short stories that I loved, and the stories were all lists. They were lists. And in those lists, stories were developed. It was brilliant. It was cool. And some people thought it was awful because, it didn't speak to them, but that's okay because we don't have to make something that everyone is going to love. We don't have to please others. If we write something that's meaningful to us, if we do our very best work and we create something, I'm not going to say any sort of adult, I'm not going to give you any, Virginia Woolf, I can I can recommend, just because Virginia Woolf is she was a classic writer and did not have any extremely adult stuff in her stories. Okay. So in all age classes, I can't recommend writers who aren't children's writers. But you create the form. Why not? If there is something that you feel is important to create, I'm there for you. Okay. I think that's totally awesome. Victorians can't be too adult. Well, they did have some pretty strong ideas in general about being proper and all that. So yeah, in general, I think the most problematic thing about Virginia Woolf for most of you would be that until you get older, her stories probably would be a bit boring to you. Like, you'd be reading it going, why am I reading this? Because it's all about this sort of adult complexity stuff. and often very little happens for a long time. So anyway, so there's all different kinds of stories. So what happens to the story arc? Because we're all taught that stories have to have arcs, right? The classic story has an arc. It's got the introductory part, it's got the rising action, it's got the conflict, and it's got the resolution. It's got the climax and it's got the resolution, right? That's classic. And that's totally fine. Most of you will write a classic story because that's what most of you read, right? Now, on the other hand, there are stories where the arc is something in the story that happens, helps the character experience a change. So I remember I told you that story of the two siblings who have been locked in this really horrible conflict and their family life has been really unhappy. In a short story, that thing might be just a moment when they find something in common and they think, maybe things are getting a little better. And that's a short story, right? The change doesn't have to be huge. It doesn't have to be they lived happily ever after. And in fact, these days, those of you who read fairy tales now, if you are older, might look at fairy tales and think, that leaves a little bit to be desired here. I want more story, right? And the reason is that fairy tales are not written to develop characters and setting and all that sort of stuff. And if you didn't watch Professor Valerie's talk about short stories, she did talk about that, about what makes a story. And that fairy tales, old-fashioned tales, often don't have the stuff that modern readers want to read, which is, I'm going to add again, no reason for you not to write one if that's what you want to write. Stick to what you love. Okay. Another arc could be that the reader experiences a revelation that the character does not. Oh my goodness, does that happen? Yes, it does. There are short stories in which the reader knows more about what's going on than the characters in the story, right? It is hard, Esme. But it's also very fulfilling for the reader, right? To realize that you know something. Both Professor Valerie and I in the library recommended that you read a really classic story that has sort of this quality, okay? And that is The Gift of the Magi by O. Henry. Now, O. Henry is a classic writer. I think he was writing in the first part of the 20th century, so you might find some of his writing to be very old-fashioned, but Sapphire loves it, so good, excellent. In that story, as you're reading it, you know something that the characters don't know, right? And you're like, oh, I know this thing. And it's so fulfilling for you that you get something from it that they might not even be getting. We never find out whether the characters really learned the lesson that we, the reader, learned, right? Which is buying stuff for someone who loves you by getting rid of something that's important to you is not necessarily the right way to go. Something like that, right? We don't even know if they learned the lesson, but we learn the lesson, and it's pretty cool that we do, right? A new option opens up for the character because of the events in the story. This is another one where there's not necessarily a resolution, but something happens in the story, and I'm going to go back to this story I randomly made up about the two characters, the two siblings. They're locked in this battle, right? And maybe something in the story happens, presents them with a challenge that they both want, but they have to get along. That's sort of something where you don't need to know the rest of the story. It can be very fulfilling. Let me look at Julia's comment. Yes. So Diana Wynne Jones, Julia, is one of my very, very, very favorite writers. Okay. And there's a number of reasons for that. But one of them is that Diana Wynne Jones never met a rule about writing that she didn't break. Hello, Sadie. If you read her novels, you're going to notice that she's just breaking rules right and left. She wrote Howl's Moving Castle. The Crestomancy series is absolutely just one of the most amazing series of magic books. And I love one of her later books, which was called, what was it called? It had glass, the title. It was about this house that had magic in it. So anyway, I've never read a book by her I don't love, so you can just read. She really did some things that were very different, and she did them in a time when children's stories didn't necessarily have as many rules. So you can Enchanted Glass. Thank you, Julia. Yes. When I have this thing, whenever I have to remember a proper noun, like the title of a book or the name of an author or something, my brain will think of anything but that. I can tell you the whole plot of that book without remembering the darn name of the book. All right. So you don't necessarily have to have a classic arc. And in some cases, writers invented the stuff that now people say are rules. Okay. So you go back and read things prior to certain writers writing, and you'll find out that people didn't follow those rules. Like if you guys are into young adult fiction as it stands now didn't even really seriously start to exist in a major way until the 1990s. When I was a teenager, there was no young adult fiction section of the library. So all of those rules, people didn't have to follow those rules. Thank you, Sapphire. Rules are meant to be broken. And that doesn't mean that rules aren't helpful. A lot of times, rules can give you structure. And the next webinar I'm gonna give is about how to write when you feel blocked or don't have ideas. And one of the things that can help is to follow some rules, because that can actually be inspiring. Isn't that weird? It can also be an easy way to connect with your reader. Say you want to write something that's just completely crazy made up world that doesn't make any sense. If you have the plot structure in there that people are used to, then that gives them something to hold on to while you bring them through this crazy, unusual world that you've created, right? So rules aren't useless, but you don't have to completely live by them. You need to know what they are, and you need to know how to be able to use them in order to learn all the craft you need to learn. But if something you want to do doesn't follow a rule, don't feel like you can't do it. Exactly. All right. So any questions about what I've said so far? I'm going to go to my next section, and we'll talk about, I'll open it up for talking about anything you want to ask about after I'm done talking about all this stuff. So in general, very short stories can be closer to prose poetry, and long stories are more plot-based. All these are sort of in general things, right? In general, why might this be? So prose poetry is poetry that's written without line breaks. And there have been some great, great, great writers of prose poetry. It's not the same as flash fiction. There's a subtle difference. It's still poetry, and poetry it's just a little closer. So short stories can often be closer to poetry, but the longer you go, it tends that you get more plot. Anybody know why that would be? You're all like, ooh, to fill up the space. Sapphire says, yeah, well, sort of. Because if you go on for too long without any sort of action and anything that the reader feels that they need to happen, you're probably going to lose your readers, right? It's harder to write long without a plot, exactly. And it's boring to read something without anything to it. Well, that does depend on the reader, because, okay, there is a novel for adults that takes place, the entire plot is that the narrator rides an escalator in a mall. That is the entire plot. Okay, so pretty much anything can be done if you do it well enough. Voice is extremely important in short stories. You have very little time to establish your voice. Again, Lucas, it's an adult one. I need to come up with some more examples from kids' books, but yes, like there's a good example, Esme, that not saying the character's name, that seems like it wouldn't work, but that writer made it work, right? So I guess what I'm trying to say is that if you are called to write something that doesn't follow a rule, go with it and see what happens. You might fail, but I have a music teacher who runs jazz improvisation classes, and he says something about improvising in jazz. That's when you take your instrument and you play stuff that's not written down. You just start playing along with the backing musicians, and you make stuff up. And he says, people are scared to do this, but it's not downhill skiing, right? You make a mistake downhill skiing and you could break a leg, or much worse, right? But if you make a mistake writing a story, just keep writing, right? So Esme, if you have the name of that, go ahead and share it. This is not downhill skiing. Try stuff. Okay, voice. What even is voice? Oh my goodness, voice is so hard to define, but you know when you read something and the writer has strong voice. In fact, There's probably no really famous writers who don't have strong voice, because if they don't have strong voice, if it sounds like everybody else is writing, you aren't going to remember it, right? So, who's somebody with a really strong voice? Lemony Snicket. I mean, Lemony Snicket is like voice, right? Ernest Hemingway's voice. Well, Ernest Hemingway is definitely an adult writer, although not that you guys shouldn't read Hemingway, but but as far as trying to think of children's writers who clearly have voice. Well, you know, I talked about Harry Potter. There is so much voice in that. If you hear a paragraph from one of those books and somebody takes out the names, you're still gonna know, right? Tolkien, totally a voice. Brian Jakes, totally a voice. Yeah, so all of these people who are really known writers, when you listen, if you know their work and somebody reads it to you, you just know, right? And the cool thing about voice is that if somebody's got it, when somebody reads their work, they read it in the way that makes sense for their writing. There's just something about it. And I think for you guys, voice is about just being true to your own inspiration and way of speaking, okay? Do not feel like you need to sound like anyone else. And one of the things that I notice that young writers often do is they try to sound like their favorite writer. But if you have a favorite writer and you got to meet them and you got to ask them whether they think it would be cool that you write just like them, I know what they'd say. They'd say, stop writing like me, write like you, right? So be true to your own inspiration and your own way of speaking. And then you're going to have voice. So you don't even have to try to have voice. You sound like Jane Austen and Louisa May Alcott. There you go, Sapphire. Sometimes okay, so here's the thing that's really important to think about, that there's nothing wrong with your voice fitting in with, say, a genre. In fact, there's something right about that, right? If you love those books, Sapphire, if you love Austen and Alcott and all those books of that era, it's totally fine to write like them, right? But still having your own way of creating the story within that is totally awesome. All right. Point of view in short stories tends to be, notice again, tends to be straightforward, first person or third person limited, though not always. But first of all, let's talk about why. Short stories are short. If you have 4 narrators in a short story, you had better be a masterful writer, because that's going to be hard, right? If you have an idea for a story that needs 4 different narrators, it is probably a novel. So a story would be a time within that novel universe that you're thinking about that's important to one of the characters that one of the characters is going to tell us about. All right? So first and third limited, so first person, you know, that's I, right? Third limited is a third person point of view, he, she, they, that's limited to someone's point of view. So if you have a story where you always see things from one character's perspective, but it's in third person, that's third person limited. Third person omniscient is something that you are very unlikely to use unless you write high fantasy, okay? Most of you are not going to write omniscient because it's not natural, but in high fantasy, it's very natural. So that is one place where modern writers might write omniscient, but most of you would be very uncomfortable. Writing in an omniscient point of view would be like you trying to play soccer in Victorian clothing. You would not be comfortable. Is Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy omniscient? You know, Lucas, I can't remember. I would have to go look at it. But it's in third person. And do we get any information? I mean, there's a snarky narrator. So snarky narrator is sometimes a type of omniscience, and high fantasy and sometimes science fiction often has that snarky narrator who knows all. The question is whether they tell you everything or whether they stay within that character's point of view. So it's complicated. We could do, in fact, we should do a whole session on point of view. But in any case, in short stories, you tend to want to stick with one perspective because it's maybe two, because it's just too hard to jump around. On the other hand, there are other options. And somebody mentioned second person using you. It can be cool. We should do a whole section on point of view, and then we can talk about it. This is really important, and it's going to be so hard for you guys because you're used to reading novels, right? Because novels are so popular now. People don't read short stories as much as they used to, which is really sad because short stories are awesome. But in short stories, there can be very little world building and hardly any backstory. Okay, short stories that have tons of backstory, boring. You're going to absolutely lose your reader, because in a novel, you can get the reader totally into what's happening, then go into backstory, and they're still into what's happening, and they're going to forgive you that you get some backstory, right? In a short story, you're going to lose them. So you can have bits of backstory that are integrated into the story, but almost always a short story is about here and now. Now, the fact is, again, there are many short stories that have broken this rule. So if you have an idea, there are short stories where it's almost all backstory. And the voice and the characters and the setting or whatever just drive the short story forward. And it's okay, right? Yeah, so you're right, Lucas, about those of you who haven't read Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. It is a unique book. It is an iconic book. It is an unusual book. So, yeah, Esme, if you can imagine it, you can write it. I'm happy to see if one of you gets inspired to write a story that, for example, has no characters. Maybe it has no setting. I don't know. I mean, I did link in my short story links to one story that you shouldn't read if you're a really sensitive reader, because first of all, it's set in the Old South and it has some really horrible racism in it. And second of all, it is about it's sort of like a horror story, though there isn't any killing in it. But in that story, which is called A Rose for Emily, the perspective is the townspeople. It's all we. There is no narrator. We don't know who we are. They're just people. And we never get in the heads of any of the characters. We don't know what's going on through almost the whole story. And the whole story ends with finding a single gray hair. And then you, the reader, understand the whole story based on one image. So what type of story is it, Aveline? Are you Aveline or Aveline? I forget. I don't want to say your name wrong. I hate saying people's name wrong. I usually, with a class that I teach every week, I make sure I've got everybody's name. Aveline, right? Anyway, Ian, thank you. It's a story by William Faulkner, who was one of the greatest story writers of the American Southern Gothic tradition. And his writing was his own. He didn't follow rules, and he just wrote what felt right to him, and he produced great, great stories. A Rose for Emily, I believe, is one of the great American short stories. But like I said, don't read it if you know, it's got some stuff in it, because he didn't try to sugarcoat what it was like in the South back then. He was not himself someone who wrote racist literature, but he depicted the racism the way it was. So there's definitely some stuff in there. Exactly, Esme. Stuff. One of my students once asked me, so define stuff, and I'm like, this is one of those things. Okay. So your world building has to be integrated. And I have this thing that's been in progress forever that I don't know if I'll ever finish it, but it's a series of stories set in a sort of futuristic, slightly dystopian world. And since each short story is supposed to be standalone, it's really tricky. I just put in the details that need to be there. I can't do any world building in the story, right? And so it's a really fun challenge. And someday I might actually finish that. All right, it is a flexible form. This is really what I want you guys to walk away with from my point of view. Like I said, Valerie and I are very different writers, we're very different teachers, and we're very different readers. We met in a book club, and when it got around to, you know, who liked this book and who didn't, Valerie and I probably disagreed more often than we agreed. And that's totally fine, right? Because we are all different people. Short story to me is a flexible form. You can do almost anything with it. Most of you will write traditional short stories, and that's totally fine too. For every rule about short stories, I can find you a famous or well-respected story that breaks it. Every rule. And I think how I've been answering that, because a writer who is called to write something, that an entire novel that happens on an escalator, an entire story in which we don't know what any of the main characters are thinking or why they do what they do, because it's all narrated from this group of townspeople that we never meet, we don't know anything about. Yeah, you can do it. You can do all sorts of things. You can do a short, I just read, did I put it in the classroom? I may have put it in the classroom, this really cool short story about a house, a haunted house, and it was from the point of view of the house. I think I did put it in. I read a whole bunch of stories trying to find them. One of the problems is this is an all ages class, and I can't really put anything in there that has too much stuff in it. But if you guys are more adventurous readers, go out there and find this stuff, right? How much change in the stories do you advise to put in at this stage? That's a good question. I'm going to hang on to that for a second. Short stories can be similar to novels or not, right? They can have that story arc, or they can do something different. And how? Again, same answer. If you are called to write a story in a certain way, you can make it happen. You can make a successful short story that is different. And I just encourage you to do that. Let yourself explore. Don't tie yourself to a specific story right away, unless it's the one that you know is calling for you, right? Write all different stories. Figure out which one really calls to you. Write the beginnings, or write descriptions, or just explore a lot. All right, so now first I'm going to answer Lucas's question, and then any other questions you have. So Lucas asks, how much change in the stories do you advise to put in at this stage? That totally depends on your story. All right, so this is the thing that is so interesting about short stories. With novels, there are books you can buy where they have graphed out, they have showed you the way to hook in readers. Do this at this time, do that at that time, make sure to have the characters that experience this thing at this time. Short stories are more flexible. So it really depends on your story, Lucas, right? Like if you write an action story, the characters might not change at all because the story is going to be all about how are they going to get out of this crazy situation. Our hero, the story starts with our hero hanging by one finger from a chain that is hanging from a helicopter. Ah, right? We don't really care if the character learns anything. We just want to know if the character is going to be okay. So if you are doing a story where very little happens, the change needs to be something fundamental that the reader cares about. So if you have the beginning of a story, I'm going to go back to the random one that I made up about the two siblings. And the story opens with one of the kids going for a walk, and they just feel, she's going to say, I felt like my insides were made of rock. I felt so hard. I was so angry at my brother that I just felt like I couldn't have feelings. At my brother that I just felt like I couldn't have feelings. I was just done feeling things, right? So if she starts out the story that way, and then something happens with her brother where, say, they are shopping with one of their parents at a shopping mall, and the parent says, oh, I'm going to go do this, you guys wait here, and somebody comes and does something or says something really mean to her brother, and she feels herself getting upset. That's a change, right? Because we started with a character who felt like she was made of a rock, right? And she ends up feeling like she might cry. So that's a change in that story, even though it's not a huge thing. The superhero in an airplane didn't come and hover. It was a very futuristic airplane that can hover underneath our hero who is hanging by a finger from the chain, and the hero can let go and drop into the superhero's airplane and get saved. We don't really care, right? What our hero feels. My next webinar is going to be called Get It Out, Methods to Get Past Blocks and Aversions. All right, everyone, have a good time writing.